conservative,
Christian, mother, wife,
Air Force veteran,
gun rights advocate.
This is Stacy on the Right. Here's your host, Stacy Washington.
Welcome back, everybody, to Stacy on the Right. Stacy is out tonight, but don't worry, you're in good hands. These are the hands that are fashioned and smoothed by the beautiful sands of Southern California. I promise you are in good hands. I'm Kira Davis, sitting in for Stacy. You can follow me on Twitter at Real Kira Davis, and you can find my podcast. Just listen to yourself wherever you find your podcasts. Well, we've been talking about how we need strong leaders, strong leadership, and we need people to be clear and brave in facing these woke policies and woke mobs that are just sowing utter chaos. I don't know how else to describe what's happening in this country right now. I've never seen it like this. It does feel chaotic. And, we'll talk more about why I think that is later. Let's bring in our first guest this hour, because speaking of strong leadership, we've recently seen a couple of strong moves from Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida. One of the things he's done recently is he has enacted legislation, or signed legislation, I should say, that will limit this idea of squatters' rights. We're starting to hear stories about squatters. I live in California. Squatters are very common here. It is hugely common. But now this is becoming a real national problem in the wake of all this lawlessness. And people are asking themselves, how did we get here? And why is this even happening? So joining me now to discuss this issue is Jill Jacobson. She's a third-year law student at Boston College Law School, and she also appears regularly in the media. You can find her at Jill C. Jacobson on X. Jill, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on tonight.
Hi, Kira. Thanks for having me.
I'm really glad to have you, and I'm really glad that you're actually discussing this issue of squatters' rights. I'm going to be honest with you. It is a big problem here in California, and it's something that's always frustrated me, but it's not had a lot of national attention. A lot of people don't know that this is a thing that can happen. That might be a symptom of the decline in property ownership, but squatters' rights are really in the media right now. People are really paying attention to it. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It seems as though this squatters' rights phenomenon has almost popped up overnight. But as you rightly point out, this has been impacting homeowners for a while now. In fact, the doctrine that these squatters misinterpret to try to claim ownership is thousands of years old. And I'm happy to talk about where it comes from. But I think that it seems so ubiquitous right now because there's a big uptick in squatters due to our decline in the view of how important American private property rights are. And we can talk about reasons why that is, but it is abundantly true that especially in places like California and New York and Washington, the government is failing to emphasize the private property rights are important and to promote deterrence, that there are consequences if people violate them.
Yeah, I mean, just again, to take California as an example, every election cycle, we get a whole new slew of rules and regulations and taxes and restrictions on property owners. And it was awful during the pandemic. I mean, the government was saying, oh, we're going to help you, everybody who can't pay your rent because we're keeping you at home. But they weren't. All they were doing was passing that cost on to property owners who were having the same problems as everybody else. So there does seem to be this concerted, coordinated effort to make it as difficult as possible for people to own land privately, and then people just don't care. But I don't think people understand, Jill, what a homeowner has to go through to get someone out of their home. And that is absolutely shocking. We saw the case of the woman in, I believe it was New York, who was arrested, right, for trying to kick squatters out of her property. What's going on specifically in New York City? Because I was reading one of your articles, I was reading some comments you were making on the squatters' rights case, and you're saying, look, these people are not using the actual law. They're actually twisting the law, and this is it's a twisting of a traditional law. But why is this such an egregious matter in a place like New York City all of a sudden?
Yeah, so if you see headlines saying things like the law allows you to take people's homes, insinuating that squatting is legal, that is not true. So squatters' rights, as they're traditionally conceived of, also known as adverse possession, that represents a legal doctrine that allows people to take abandoned property if they fulfill certain requirements. So a common case goes like this. You know, two farmers have lived next to each other for decades. One day, one farmer says to the other, you know, I just checked my deed, and that strip of land you always farm your tomatoes on that you think's your farm, it's actually on my land. So I'm entitled to the land and the tomatoes too. Under this doctrine of adverse possession, the true owner abandoned his land, that strip, by failing to realize it was his for decades. So it temporarily belonged to no one, and since the neighbor had been taking care of it and farming on it for decades in good faith, the law will give it to him so that it'll be used productively. So it's to prevent truly abandoned property or mistaken boundaries from lying dormant and unused for decades. It's not to make it difficult for true owners to assert their rights. So if these squatters that we are seeing are hiding out in people's homes or locking the doors and not letting them in, when they get to court, they will lose. 99.99% of the time, the true owners will get their property back. And that's because in most states, it requires that the squatter live there for anywhere from 10 to 30 years without the true owner protesting it. So, you know, it is very unlikely, almost impossible, that these squatters really take the deed and get permanent ownership. The problem, though, is that most states make it really, really hard to get to that point because they don't allow law enforcement to immediately come evict them. The true owner actually has to go into court, hire a lawyer, which is extremely expensive, pay money to be represented in court, and get proof from a judge that they're the true owner, that they then take to law enforcement who will evict the squatters. So this can take months, even longer, and in the interim, that person has lost their home, or if they're a landlord, they've lost their livelihood, which is really scary.
It is really scary. And I think what is also scary is that you're the taxpayer. The property is creating tax revenue for the state, and yet the state is not taking in a lot of cases, not taking the side of the taxpayer, which would make more sense for the state. This is more proof to me that we have activists running government these days and not people who actually care about, monitoring or serving the community. But my aunt had this problem up in Canada. Things are a little bit crazier up there, but she ended up having to pay her tenants to leave. It seems to me like that was their goal the whole time. They didn't want to get involved in the legal system, but they really wanted to push her to a point where it was just worth it if she just gave them a check for a few $1,000s and they vacated. I think, do you see that that's a tactic that some people take, and maybe that's the reason why squatting is becoming a thing as well?
I think when people start to take the system into their own hands, when they, as the citizens, have to resort to enforcing the rule of law, that's when you know the system is broken, right? If you can no longer rely on police to evict strangers who have trespassed on your home, and you can no longer rely on the courts because they're so backed up and they take so long to reinforce your rights, that's when you know the system is broken. We should not be resorting to vigilante justice, but unfortunately, in a lot of cases, people are striking that balance because they just don't see it as worth it to waive.
Yeah, I've been looking at video clips, reels, I guess the kids call them these days, reels on, these businesses that are popping up around this. They're squatter removers, that's their business. Have you seen some of this stuff?
Yeah, I have actually. And I think this really represents what Rob Henderson, he's a sociologist, would call luxury beliefs. This idea of squatters' rights is a luxury belief, which means that a lot of elites, particularly in progressive circles who make policies, they don't have to feel the effects of their policy. They can afford to have luxury beliefs. A very common example is defund the police. A lot of people that are in favor of defunding the police, they don't live in the kinds of neighborhoods that need police, right? They live in gated communities with security where it's okay for them to applaud defunding the police because they don't need them like the everyday person does. This is very similar in that a lot of people who promote squatters' rights in progressive cities live in gated neighborhoods with security where they don't have to fear this. They're not landlords who have won property that make their livelihood. And they certainly don't have to result to everyday citizens like these squatter protectors to help them avenge their private property rights. It's really unfortunate.
I'm going to get a little ideological on you here, and I want you to respond to this. I want to know what you think. I think that this is part of a larger idea of, I have talked about this on this show before, but I was reading recently The Red Scarf with my daughter, which is the story of the Chinese Communist Revolution. And one of the parts that really just has sat with me, and I can't stop thinking about it, is how the government began to change language. And that's how they began to start to create division between citizens. And they began to use the term landlord as a slur. And so the idea was to demonize people who owned property as greedy or people who wanted to keep you from owning things. And the term landlord actually did become an actual slur, like the way we might use the B word or, it became an actual slur. And then it became justifiable to take those people's properties, to imprison them, and even to murder them. And I really genuinely feel that there are people in our government who that is their intention. They want to make owning land something that should be embarrassing and shameful. And I've heard them use the term property owners and landowner as a slur. I feel like that's intentional.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think a lot of people, particularly progressive politicians, are very sort of anti-capitalist, anti-business in general, even small business owners, which is ironic. And as most landlords are, most of them are small business owners. And I think that they're particularly hostile to them too. So I see where you're going, but I also think that it's just an attitude about criminality in general. I think we're seeing just a lack of deterrence, a cultural shift in not taking crime particularly seriously. And I think it's more than that. It's more that than anything else. Perhaps it's anti-American sentiment in general. We're seeing a lot of that, particularly on college campuses. And private property rights, owning a home, is the American dream. I mean, that is the bedrock American principle, among a few other things. So if you are anti what America stands for, then private property rights is one of the first thing on your list.
Yeah. And I mean, I think probably if you go back in history, that's always the first thing that any authoritarian government removes from people is the right to own things privately. What are your thoughts about what's going on in Florida? Governor Ron DeSantis has taken quite a public stand, and he has signed legislation that will make this type of activity illegal, easier to prosecute. What's your sense about that? How much do you know about that move by Governor DeSantis?
Yeah, I think it's wonderful what he's done as usual, and other states need to follow suit because, as I tried to convey, these claims will not be successful. 99.99, perhaps more, of these squatters will not gain permanent title to these properties. The only thing standing between residents having their property back is the policy around when law enforcement can actually get involved to evict these people. So it's not if, it's when. And Governor DeSantis decisively said law enforcement can get involved immediately. And he instantly solved this problem. So I think a lot of other states need to follow suit. And it's unfortunate because I will say these laws are on the books for good reason. They don't address squatters specifically. They address tenants. And we need tenant protection, right? If you piss your landlord off for some reason, let's say you're a day late paying rent, you don't want him to be able to call the police and evict you immediately. You want to compromise. You want to try to work it out. Tenants do deserve some baseline protection, but these are trespassers. They're not tenants, and those laws should not apply to them. And Governor DeSantis made that very clear, and other states should do the same, I think.
I think that's very interesting. That I love doing this show because I always learn things I didn't know. And tonight, that'll be, I think, what I take away from tonight's show. That idea that squatters' rights they're actually not meant to be used this way. And I guess that's further proof that you can have all the good laws in the world if you want. You can have great legislators who create great law that works well. But if you don't have a body politic that's willing to enforce the law as intended, it doesn't matter what the books say. It's just going to be chaos. You have to have people in leadership positions who are willing to prosecute the law as it stands.
Yeah, and I also think the underlying assumption is that people will respect the rule of law and promote it. We don't often assume that our government will be the one encouraging lawless behavior and violation of private property rights, right? Like, the law does not have that assumption baked into it. But unfortunately, that's what we're seeing in a lot of cities like New York and San Francisco. So it's time to adapt, and hopefully we can restore people's private property rights because they're really, really important.
They're very important. I think the rest of the American dream, as you put it, rests on the ability, whether or not you do own property, but the ability to own property. It's one of the most important things about the founding of this country. Well, Jill, thank you for joining the show tonight. I've learned a lot from you. You can follow Jill on X at Jill C. Jacobson. And is there anything else any other places you would like people to visit to find out more about you and what you're doing out there?
No, I routinely post my writing and media on X. So thank you so much, Kira. This was great.
Thank you, Jill. I appreciate it. God bless you. Good luck out there. All right, everybody, let's take a break. And when we come back, we'll continue on with this discussion. I'm Kira Davis, filling in for Stacy Washington, and you are listening to Stacy on the Right.